Good
The first
practice.
one's kind of funky. And we are live.
Hello.
All right.
Hi.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
So we are, well, I'm excited because we are going to start these weekly hangouts to specifically focus our attention on the issue of pornography that's been around the world. And so I'm really excited you guys to be doing this and thankful that we came in contact with both of you. And so anyway, I should probably just share really quick. I'm Jennifer, and this is
Brian.
you guys can share your if you want.
Go ahead. I'm Michelle.
And I'm Tyler.
Awesome. So we had decided that you guys will share your story tonight, which I think would be awesome, and I can't wait to hear more about it. I've heard a little bit. Brian's heard a little bit too, but so we'll just give you guys the floor for a while, and we can butt in every once in a while if we want.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool.
So
Well, where do you want to start?
I guess, do you want to know when the addiction started? Is that
Well,
kind
I'm just curious, what have you guys, so how long, I know that you're in recovery of this, obviously, Tyler, and so I'm just curious, when did this addiction start for you? And maybe it didn't even become an addiction at first, so what was just your beginnings in this, personally?
The very beginnings, I was first exposed to pornography when I was about 6. I was living or staying with my grandpa down in St. George, Utah area, which was about a 3 or 4 hour drive from where my family lived at the time, and I was hanging out with him for a few weeks during the summer, and some neighbor kids I was hanging out with took me in their home to go use the restroom or get a bite to eat or something. I don't remember, and they took me in their bathroom, and their dad had some magazines there, and so that was the first time I ever saw anything like that. And I don't think at that time it was like an instant addiction or anything. I was interested and intrigued because I hadn't seen pictures like that before. But later, as I became older, I was exposed to more. Anyway, I was exposed to pornography in other ways later throughout my teenage years, and it didn't become an addiction as far as the pornography side goes for a long time. As a young teenager, I did begin to masturbate for a while, and that was a problem on and off, probably from about 17 on, somewhere in there. And so that kind of was something that I fought. And later in my early 20s, about 21 or 22, is when I first got online and found internet porn, and that's where that's kind of where I got started into it. And for me, it wasn't something that I initially sought out. It was, back then, the filters were terrible, and I wasn't smart about not knowing to open like spam and stuff like that. I just didn't know, and that's where kind of the beginnings of my addiction began. And of course, later, after some of those earlier experiences online, I did begin to seek it out, and at some point, it became very difficult to control.
Can I ask you a question really quick? So, Tyler, when you're talking about that 20 to 21-year-old you going online, so can you just, I'm just curious, like, what was it that got you, you shared a little bit, but what really got you online, and do you even remember your first exposure to that online? Do you remember it, or not, I don't want you to think about the actual detail of
it. No, it doesn't bring up, it doesn't trigger me to think about it. I think, I don't remember my very first one necessarily, but I'm pretty sure that it was as spamming emails. that would just link to something, and as soon as I would go to the link or whatever, it would just launch a whole bunch of pages. It's the kind of thing that I just remember the first time it happened, I was appalled. I couldn't believe it probably launched 12 or 15 browser pages at once.
So it was an accident. Sorry to interrupt you, but
That
Yeah.
was an accident.
Okay.
Yeah, on my part. And I learned at the very beginning, and then later, like I said, I began to seek it out more, and more out of just being curious. But that led to it being more of a habit.
how long do you think it took before? How long was it in that curiosity stage were you until you realized that maybe this was something you really needed? Maybe not even noticing it was an addiction yet, but just something that you were really looking forward to.
Well, I didn't consider it an addiction till way after we were married, but it was an addiction.
Right.
I never thought of it in those terms. So your question was, help me remember that again a little better.
I'm asking.
I think a lot of people don't understand still that this is a real addiction like anything else, like alcohol and drugs and things like that. Maybe clarification on what it was that kept drawing you back to that. Habitually, that was more than just once in a while. It was just more of it was a more consuming thing that you really couldn't really do without.
So more than any one type of thing that I was looking for, it was more of a feeling that I was trying to satisfy, a lack. It was an insecurity, specifically for me, of being good enough, of being enough, and especially where the opposite sex was concerned. I was single and dating, trying to date, and just very insecure about that whole process. And so this was something that later I learned to use it kind of as a coping mechanism, essentially. And that's one of the reasons pornography is addictive, is that as a coping mechanism, it works very, very well. When I say works, it doesn't do a person good in their life overall, but it does numb or overpower negative emotions or feelings that we're feeling at the time very effectively. So,
Can I ask you another question really quick? We were just talking about this in our addiction recovery group last night, and we were talking about, many times this comes up, that addiction is, and it talks about it in 12 steps, is there are character weaknesses that we have that allow us to have these addictions. Or I'm just curious, what is your thought on that in that process, especially when you look back at this time that you're talking about? I mean, do you think that that's, because there's a lot to talk about in that subject, I know, but do you know what I mean with the, because I don't know, still don't really know how I feel totally about that. I'm curious how you feel about that.
character weaknesses, I'm not quite sure what you mean, but
Actually, we could have stuff.
Maybe are what character weaknesses that you may have had at the time that you could see you were trying to fill those gaps with something, and the pornography was the thing that filled that gap, or so it seemed, or numbed it, or made it go away. Maybe some of those character weaknesses, you spoke briefly about what some of those deep character weaknesses, I think, even beneath your fear of dating and things, might have been.
yeah, it's a feeling of acceptance. I touched on it for me, just being enough, being good enough, meaning just in general, not feeling like I could measure up to other people. I don't know.
Can I interject for a second?
Yeah.
One thing that I don't know if Tyler has shared this at all before, but whoops, sorry. He grew up in a really remote location in the West Desert of Utah. And so he was in a small branch where there were not very many girls to date. I mean, this is before his mission. And I knew him back then. I've known him for years. And he just wore insecurity and awkwardness like a suit. I mean, it was just, I think he just felt so
Thank
isolated
you for that
from,
right
but I think he just felt so isolated from social interaction in general that when it came time to date and especially after the mission, look for a wife, I think it just brought up a lot of that, like he said, those feelings of, am I really going to attract somebody into my life who will want to marry me? That coupled with, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he also grew up with a father that was extremely critical and made him wonder so often if he was good enough just in that father-son relationship. So he was carrying around a lot of, I don't know, insecurity. That's the only word that comes to my mind in general about his identity, his core identity as being good enough. So I think when he started dating and maybe the results were not, maybe not everybody was accepting his invitation to go out or whatever, it just kept validating that. Where pornography, they show up. They, you know what I mean? They in a false way accept you just as you are. And so I think that's part of why that was so appealing for him.
Well, and it wasn't so much about what I was seeing on the screen as how I was feeling inside, and just there might be a scenario being played out on the screen, but for me it was more about what I was imagining myself being accepted and being able to attract
Desirable,
a desirable
yeah.
partner or whatever, and so that's kind of where it where it started from. But
Do you think that that locked something in when you, because that's interesting when you think about how to feel desirable in that sense from something that doesn't even really interact with you except energetically in that way. It's interesting that, so do you feel like that's maybe why it even becomes an addiction, because now this is kind of locked into your cells and into your brain and into that space of that weakness that you're thinking it's getting stronger just by every time you go on the computer? And does that
well,
make sense?
definitely from the standpoint of brain science, we know that as you over and over experience a thought or emotion and take a certain course of action, the brain just wants to keep us alive and keep us in that good state if it can. And so whenever I'm feeling negative emotion, it just opens the file cabinet and says, okay, what do we do when we have this problem? Oh, this worked really well, and go right back to it. And again, it works really, really well. I had other great coping mechanisms too. I could down a half a quart of ice cream and feel a little bit better. And again, not healthy, not good for my overall life, but it helped numb it. I used to play a lot of video games, and it was kind of a similar thing. Just retreat, backing out of my real world and trying to excel or find acceptance in a different one.
What's coming to me and what maybe this is what resonates with you, and that I've realized what we're learning with people in this addiction, and from my own experience, that realizing that it's almost like with these insecurities set in place from whatever age and for whatever reason, the realities of life are, there is responsibility, there is jobs, there is marriage, there is family, there is, spiritual aspect of life, there's responsibility, and all these different things. And when there's an insecurity that's so deep that it's almost like when those when faced with those realities of what should be, or ideally what should be, it's almost like panic time, and it's like run off to find whatever it is that's going to cure that insecurity or that fear in that moment. And the pornography and becomes a very powerful way to do that. A total facade, but very powerful in the moment.
It is. And unfortunately, with a brain that becomes addicted, and my ability, we understand now, science is helping us to understand some of what's going on a little more clearly, and I'm sure in time that will get even better. But to know that once the addiction starts, I don't even feel, I mean, people often go, why do you turn to that when you're feeling bad? Well, or whatever. To know that when you're addicted, you actually feel bad all the time. You're not even turning to that to feel good after a while. You're turning that just to go back to normal. So I'm feeling worse all the time in an everyday, regular way. And so
maybe go.
Was, you're fine. That for me was where I didn't realize what was going on, but now that I understand that, I can look back in my life and see how overtaken I was, and how I fought this so much, and yet it was just such a terrible conflict inside of myself, because on one hand, morally and stuff, I did not want any part of it, and on the other hand, I couldn't live without it anymore. So it was a real love-hate relationship with myself. So anyway.
So I'm curious just to go, because I'm sitting here thinking there's so much in all of these stories that you guys have, that we all have. I mean, we could just dissect piece after piece, don't you think? And that's what's going to be cool as these weeks go on, as we keep doing this and interacting and finding and really digging into these stories and finding the subjects that are going to support not only ourselves but others. It's going to be pretty cool. But I would love to go back to just your story also of, so at that point when you realized you were addicted, or maybe wherever you want to start from that point, or you got married, right, and you were already addicted, but you didn't realize you were addicted, or you didn't want to admit that you were addicted. Is that the case?
Didn't really realize. I knew, even long before I got married, I knew that I had a problem with this, and I met with my spiritual leaders and talked about it and confessed it, and I had a wide variety of responses, from just pray more and read your scriptures more, to maybe we should see a therapist, which I did for a while. A lot of different things that really didn't help that much, and they would help sometimes, but primarily I was just fighting it with willpower, and I would do okay for a while, but inevitably fail, and then inevitably beat myself up for it and start the cycle all over again. And that is something that if we would have understood if I would have understood what I understand now, I would have been so much easier on myself after those mistakes. Not condoning the behavior by any means, but I would spend months just in a cycle of shame and self-hatred and frustration, and I mean, I really got depressed and all kinds of things, which don't help with the recovery process at all. We didn't have things, at least I wasn't aware of anything like the 12-step program for this at the time, and there were a lot less resources than there are now. So I don't think it was as widespread of a problem as it is now either. But
what were the main things, would you say, that for you personally got you to want to actually take steps to overcome it, to beat it, and why?
Well, at an early time, I just knew that the way that I've been raised in my religious beliefs say that this is not an activity that I wanted to be involved in. And so from that standpoint, I wanted to not participate in it anymore. And that's what early on made me seek help. And I'll be honest, I sought a lot of help at the beginning, and when my results weren't very good, I kind of retreated back into isolation a lot. And so, and I would come out of that at times. I've talked to during the roughly, I don't know, 16 or 15 years that I dealt with this, I talked to a lot of different spiritual leaders about it, and tried to get a lot of help, but I think it wasn't until after we were married, and I just had a lot more to lose, and I finally, the pain of what could be lost overcame my desire for it, or the pain that I was feeling that led me to it. And one of the things that really made a huge difference was Michelle I remember a talk that we had where she, without knowing it, she basically drew a line in the sand and set a boundary for me and just told me, Tyler, this just can't continue. We've got to solve this, find a different way to live, and for a different way for you to be. And it wasn't done out of anger or hatred or frustration. Yep.
There was a little bit.
Okay.
I was gonna say, that's impressive, girl.
There was a lot of frustration at my activity when I had relapses, and when she first found out about a lot of this, of course. But when she had this talk with me, I felt at least her love for me and her desire to make our marriage work and our family stay together, and that meant a lot to me and still does.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about what might have been if, in a bad way, if she had chosen to just say, okay, we're just done, without working on it, that it makes me very grateful for her patience, her love, and her willingness to go through this, because frankly this is the last thing she ever, probably any woman wants, but for her and her experiences that she's had up until we got married, it was like pretty much the worst case scenario for her. So her sticking it out with me is a big testament of her love.
Well, and I think, I know in a lot of people I talk to, and even LDS people, but just Christian people and anyone that friends, they wonder, well, why is pornography so bad? Even the idea of, well, sex and those things are just part of a relationship. They're part of life. Just experience it, all this stuff. And so you're talking about this devastation, and your marriage is going to be broken up. And I am like, I'm curious. Okay, so what is it doing to you? I know you talked about this brain thing going on and this addiction, but why, when you say an addiction, what is it that made it an addiction for you, and why really is it devastating even to your wife and to your marriage? Like, what is it in there for you guys that made it that difficult, maybe that dark, that destructive?
Okay, well, my story along with his story, when I was a little girl, I was sexually abused by my grandfather, who I believe was a sex addict. The reason I believe that is that he had various affairs and molested several children. Anyway, there was obviously an issue there where he was behaving in a way that seemed out of control in some ways, but we didn't talk about addiction at the time. And he eventually went to prison, and there were some consequences there. But I grew up with that experience. And then as I started dating, I realized that quite a few of the young men that I dated had issues with pornography. And I remember I had this little high school boyfriend, and he tried to confess this to me one day, and I was so naive, and I didn't know I mean, I knew there was such a thing as pornography, but he's telling me, oh, I watch bad movies. And I'm thinking, rated R movies, okay, well, thanks for the confession, you know. Anyway, so even in this little high school relationship, it ended up that he betrayed me and had this other girl on the side. And we weren't sexually active or anything. At least he wasn't with me. I don't know what was going on with other people, but just that experience kind of shook up my world, and I thought, I feel like I don't know if I can trust men. And it wasn't just those two things. There were a lot of other things too, with other men in my family and my life. And so when I started dating Tyler, I remember sitting with him one day and just venting all of my disgust and fear and like, what is wrong with men? It feels like all they care about is sex and they don't care who they hurt to get it, you know. And pornography is the last thing I think I could ever handle, or infidelity of any kind. And he just listened to me so patiently. And I really have to hand it to him, because after I just raved on and on about it, he said, well, I feel like I need to let you know that this is something that has been a struggle for me. And at the time, he was in a better place, but it kind of caught me off guard. And I was seeing a therapist at the time, because anytime I started dating anyone seriously, all these issues would come up for me where I'd get freaked out and I just couldn't proceed in the relationship. And so I went through several relationships thinking that they were just all the wrong person. And Tyler helped point out that maybe it's something inside of you that's just being triggered. So anyway, so I went through that, and I went into our marriage knowing that this had been something in his past. But we had made this arrangement, I thought, that if that temptation or that compulsive side of it ever started coming up for him, that he would come to me and we would talk about it and work through it. And so a few years into our marriage, Elder Holland gave a talk at General Conference. It was back in 2010, and it was about pornography. And prior to this, I kept getting kind of an impression to just ask him about it. And I thought, no, I do not want to be the nagging wife who's always bringing up the pornography. He promised he would talk to me about it. Anyway, after that talk, I got that impression very strongly again. So he was at work one day, and at the time he worked in our basement, which is not ideal if you have a pornography problem, but I just sent him this little chat message, and we would chat off and on throughout the day, and I said, something like, so how are you doing with the pornography? And there's no answer for a while, and I thought, oh gosh, oh no. So he's down there. At the time, he'd been struggling for a while, and it was getting more frequent. And so he had been praying for a way to tell me, because he was just so scared to tell me. Like, that's pretty typical, I think. And I ask him, just straight out ask him. So he's over there thinking, oh my gosh, this is the answer to my prayer, but I'm just too... Anyway, so
terrified.
He came upstairs and told me that that was something that was going on. And I felt upset, just not even so much that it was happening, but that our agreement to actually talk about it before it had gone this far didn't happen. That kind of shook me up a little. And he had an initial confession, but then it was like he had to just tell me in stages of, oh yeah, and then there's this, and then there's that, and then this is going on too. And I just thought, I remember at one point we got stuff out, and I said, okay, please, I'm just a really big person about, I want to know the truth. Like, I'm not one of those women who's like, I'd rather not know, because I know that's how some feel. I'd rather just not know that that's happening. So I told him, I don't care. I mean, I do care that it's happening. I just want you to bring me in and let me be a part of this, and not the viewing of the pornography, but just the dealing and coping and trying to work through the recovery.
My experience.
Yeah. And so, again, we decided, okay, yes, I'm going to check in with him every so often. We're going to talk about it. We're going to see how we're doing. So we started doing that, and for a long time, every time we talked about it, I'm doing good. I'm doing really good. There hasn't been any kind of relapse or anything like that. Well, a while into this, I start getting this weird feeling again, like, and I'm thinking, I don't know what to do here because we're talking about it, and he's telling me he's good, but I don't feel really comfortable for some reason.
Right.
So one day, he shows up for lunch, a lunch break. He came home from work, and at this time he was working out of the house again. And I have this big questionnaire for him to fill out.
The survey.
Like, because I thought maybe it's just too awkward for him to just talk it out loud. So maybe if he just writes down some answers, he can be more honest. And he got mad. And for me, that was kind of a red flag, like, oh gosh, something is going on, and he's not telling me. So, again, he reveals some more information. And by now, I just feel completely heartbroken. And it's not even just about the fact that he's looking at other naked women or having sexual experiences with other people. It's that he's not being honest with me. After I've tried to give him so many... I've tried to be patient and loving. I mean, I was definitely emotional and angry sometimes that this is a part of our marriage, but because I just couldn't get over the fact that I would ask him outright and he would lie to my face about it and say, no, I'm fine, nothing's happening. So that really shook me up, and it just made me feel like, I don't know if I can't be married to someone I can't trust. And yet my definition of trust had changed, not from, you'll never hurt me. That's not like, I can only trust you if you never hurt me. It's that I can only trust you if I can guarantee somehow that you're going to be forthcoming with how you're hurting me or whatever's happening. And so I remember talking with him one day, and I feel like it was the Spirit told me, Michelle, he cannot be honest with you because he's not being honest with himself. He's not really acknowledging the seriousness of this, or he's minimizing everything. And so I just told him that one day. I said, well, I realize I'm asking a lot of you because you're not even capable of being honest with yourself, let alone me. And I remember the look on his face was like, oh, maybe there's truth to that. And so
that really hit me.
I feel like that's where it kind of cracked open for us in a new way as far as the recovery. It was like, oh, I have to start practicing being honest with myself as far as admitting to myself that I'm doing this, that it's not... Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, what were you doing? So once you had that crack, when you say cracked open, so you had that experience of this realization that he's not being honest. So what did you do at that point? How did you handle the situation?
It was at that time that, like he talked about when I said, I cannot go on any longer like this. I have to, if you're going to continue lying to me about this, then I'm going to have to leave the home with the children. I don't feel safe here. There's not safety. I don't know what I'm really dealing with. I can't trust you when you say this is all I've done, because it keeps coming out that's not true. So for me, I had to create a boundary that said, if you're not going to practice honesty with me, then I can't be here, because I have to make my decisions based on the whole picture, I mean, I need you to lay it out on the table for me so I can say, okay, I can work with this, or
so
nope,
he decided to do that. He was willing to do that.
Yeah. And I can feel it. I'm pretty in tune with when things are not right. And so for me, I started feeling like, yeah, I think, he's actually being honest with me. And also, when he was just willing to give me information that I think he had never given me before, I started realizing okay,
Yeah.
this is a new experience. And not only that, but his countenance and his energy that he was carrying around all the time changed. He wasn't so irritable and like and just kind of closed off, like he had something to hide. You know, he was a little more bright and
Well, that's what it does. Honesty does that, and it's interesting because honesty, you know, as you're talking, these levels of trust and honesty that we learn through this process is really interesting too, isn't it? Because it sounds like you're going through the process. I know we've done the same thing where I'm realizing honesty isn't exactly what I thought honesty meant 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 3 years ago. It seems to have new meaning to me throughout I mean, each month that goes by, I'm seeing honesty a little bit different. And in that, my trust even changes. Like, I understand what trust means also. You guys find that?
oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. Because I mean, I understand it was kind of a very immature way of viewing it, but I just thought, well, I'll trust my husband as long as he never does anything wrong.
Well, that's all you know. That's all we know at that point.
That's how it begins.
Yeah, and yet that creates a very toxic environment for somebody who is struggling with something that morally or, you know, whatever, inappropriate in a marriage. And so, at least according to our beliefs in our marriage. And so, I don't know, I think that's when that's when the recovery started in a more
In earnest.
in earnest, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it sounds like also you guys you started recovery together at that point.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting though because for me, I didn't even think about the fact that I need recovery. It was like, I mean, it was triggering a lot of the things that I just brought from my childhood, and so and it's interesting how it's kind of the perfect storm for us in our marriage because of some things that I had gone through. Intimacy was harder than I expected it to be. I didn't think that would be a problem. I never sensed that dating people. I mean, I felt the normal feelings and whatever. But as soon as I was married, that side of myself just shut down and clammed up. And it was really discouraging for me and for Tyler. And so
That's a whole nother topic, isn't it?
We'll cover that one next.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later. But he took that as a lot of rejection instead of just, my wife is dealing with an issue. It triggered in him all those rejection feelings and
of
inadequacy.
Yeah.
And so, like you said earlier, what does he turn to when he's feeling that panicky, I'm not enough feeling? Well, in the past, it had been pornography. And so that's, I think, how it started to creep back into our marriage. But, I mean, it's so multifaceted, it's hard to say
Right.
that was the only reason. So
It played a role.
yeah.
Summing up what you're saying, I was thinking it was pretty interesting how you both come into the marriage with certain weaknesses and things from the past that play into everything, and then through Tyler's addiction and your willingness to see him in a different way and accept him differently has actually helped you to heal from your things that you may not have been able to otherwise.
Oh yeah.
Only because you both were willing to look at things a different way and to work together and to not shun each other, but to actually say, wait, we have issues, let's work on this together.
Well, and I also like what she said. You actually had a boundary. I think I don't know if you guys have noticed that there's this, and that would be an awesome one to talk about too, just what does boundaries really look like in this addiction in a marriage, especially because you start understanding what you really truly want in your life as you're going through this as a wife through it. You start going, wait a minute, this really is what I'm not willing to sacrifice anymore, and you kind of stand up for that. And in that standing up actually does help. It helps the marriage, which is really cool because, it's just like your husband standing up for what he believes in would help the marriage also. It's the same for us.
Yeah, the boundary thing has kind of evolved into our, like we've spoken about that at different things and realized that that's something a lot of couples are struggling with, and maybe not even just with this issue, but that boundaries are important to understand. And they're not, we teach it as healing through loving boundaries. It's not like punishment. It's just about, like I said, just saying, okay, here's where I draw the line, and you can either come and meet me with my standard or my expectation or whatever.
It draws
Or-
out and invites the very best in the other person.
I think that's the key.
It's
Yeah.
not it's not done out of anger or hatred, or there may be some frustration there that needs to be dealt with, but that's not the purpose of the boundary. The boundary comes out of love. It might be tough love, but it's definitely out of love, and says, here, this is your best opportunity to change, and it really gives the person in a case of if I can talk, in a case of addiction like this, it gives the addict a chance to really show whether or not he or she is going to choose the addiction over the relationship.
Well, and we can talk about that in more depth.
Well, I think we should, yeah, definitely, because we probably need to stop now because we but I will say I appreciate what you guys have been saying, and I think I'm just hearing the theme of too. There's a space of unconditional love in all of this that I think is hopefully going to be the thread as we keep talking. That there's this, that we're learning how to unconditionally love and love as Christ would have us love one another and how He loved us, and it'll be cool too to have some other people come on that have gone through this, that have been able to experience even differently than we've been able to experience. Because I think we have such different experiences, and those boundaries are different for everybody, and it's all, I mean, it's just so multifaceted.
Right.
It's gonna be cool to see where it goes from here. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
It's nice
Well,
to meet you.
we could see anyway, we can talk again, but we
Okay.
can sign off, and I'm going to stop the broadcast, and then we're still going to be on, but it won't be on anymore live. So I'll
Okay.
stop.
Or can I say one thing before you